Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be using Figma to create a landing page design, which you can see right over here. And this landing page design is inspired by my CSS course because this project is actually something that we build in the CSS course. So if you're interested in taking this course and learning more about CSS so you can really take your design skills to the next level, it's going to be linked down in the description below. So let's get started now. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. And as I mentioned in the intro, we're going to be building out the design for one of the projects that I built for my CSS course. And I really like this project because not only does it have great CSS principles in it, but it also has really great design principles and things that you need to think about when designing a project. And for the rest of this tutorial, I'm actually going to turn off my face camera just so I don't cover up anything in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. And also to get started, I have all of the different icons and images we're going to need for this website already compiled for us, so we don't have to worry about doing that later. So now when you have Figma open to a new project, the very first thing that you need to do in order to start drawing and creating a design is to set up a frame. So up here in the top left hand corner, we can select a frame. And then we just drag out this frame to be any size that we want. And for our purposes, we're going to pretend that we have a 1920 by 1080 aspect ratio for a desktop screen, which is fairly common. So let's just type in here 1920 for our width and 1080 for our height. And that's going to give us here, as you can see, a 1920 by 1080 rectangle. And this essentially represents one screen worth of space inside of our design. Now, before we get further on this design, we first need to understand what this design is for, and this particular web page is going to be the landing page for a Web Dev Simplified bootcamp if that was something that I had. So that's the idea that we're creating with this web page. So we need to make sure that we think about the use case of this web page when we're designing it. And the use case is to get people to sign up for this bootcamp. That's the number one thing that this landing page we're creating needs to do. So we have to make sure we know that when we're designing and keep that in mind. So the next thing I want to do is first focus on the first thing the user is going to see, which is that landing page top portion header of our website, which is the first thing that'll load into their application. And what I'm thinking is that we should do a full screen image for this landing page. I think in general, that's a pretty clean look that you can see across tons of different websites. So I think it's a great, safe design to start with that'll always look good. So obviously, the first thing we need is going to be our image. Luckily, I've already selected this image for us, and we can just place this image into our frame and expand it out until it's wide enough to fill our entire screen. As you can see here, we have 1920 by 1080, and this image takes up that full space. The next thing that we need to focus on is going to be our main title section, which is going to be in the dead center of this image. So let's select the text icon up here, and we're just going to drag out some text in the middle of our page. Whoops. Drag that out, and then we can just type in whatever text we want. I'm just going to make our font here quite a bit larger so that we can really easily see this. So let's just say that this is going to be 144 is the font size, and this is going to say WDS Bootcamp. And let's just expand this all the way out so we can see all of our text. And a really easy way to do that is just double click on the edge of any of the sides of your text box, and it'll make the text box as big as it needs to be to fit all of the text, but no bigger. So let's just set that right here in the center of our screen and change the color to white. So we're going to select our fill, change it to white, just like that. And we want to make this really stick out, so we're going to make it bold. And we're actually going to change the font to Gotham Rounded. Now this is a font that's not built into Figma. It's a font that I use across all of my different projects, but you can use your own font, whatever font you want. There's absolutely tons of fonts built into Figma that you can choose from. So really just go with whatever font you want. So again, let's do that little trick, double click, get this in the center just like that, and we have our title. The next thing that we're going to need is going to be our subtitle. So I'm just going to copy this down just like this. And I'm going to change this here to have a smaller text. We'll just say maybe 96 for now. And we can say from no stack to full stack. There we go. Get that in the center. And we want to just reduce this font size even further. I think it's a little bit too big. We'll try maybe 48, it's a little small, let's do 64, there we go. And then we're also going to change this to no longer be bold. We're just going to have it slightly less bold, maybe a little less than that, there we go. That way it doesn't overpower this main title. And I also think this main title is a little bit large, so let's try to reduce this font to maybe 100, and then bring this back into the center. And we're actually just going to bump it up a little bit from the center, so it's just a little bit in the top of our screen, just like that. And we'll of course obviously need to bump this font down. Let's try 50 for example. And we're again going to want to move this into the center, kind of right below our title like that. And I think that looks pretty good. But one thing you'll notice is it's really hard to actually read our text because it's this white text over this not quite super dark background. So what we need to do is actually add a mask over the top of our background to make it appear darker. So an easy way to do that is to just grab this rectangle tool here, and we can drag this out across our entire frame, just like that. And we'll move it down in the hierarchy so it's right above our image, but it's not covering our text. And then we can just change this to be completely black, just like that. And then we can drop down the opacity, let's say 20% maybe. And you can see our text is already quite a bit easier to read. If we make this 40%, you can see the text is even easier to read. And let's try it 30% maybe. And that way we can still see our image and the text is also easy to read. Now in order to make it easy to work with our frame over here, one thing we can do is select multiple elements and hit Ctrl G. That'll group these together so that we can easily work inside of this hierarchy. And we're just going to call this group our background, just like that. So we know that this is our background section. Also, I'll group up these two sections in the middle. And I'm just going to call this our title so that we know this is our title section of our page. So we have our background and our title section. The next thing that we want to work on is some type of call to action. Right now we have a really good landing page that tells the people what they're actually getting into, but we want to have some way for them to actually take action. And like I said, the most important purpose is to get people to sign up for the bootcamp. So let's add a little button in here that asks them to learn more about this, and it'll scroll them down to the sections that describe the rest of our bootcamp. So let's start to create a button with a rectangle. So we can create a rectangle here, and inside of this rectangle, we're going to need some text. So let's just make the text the same exact size as our rectangle. Whoops. There we go. And we want to have this say learn more. And again, we want this to be the exact same size as our rectangle. And then we can just group these two elements together to call them our learn more button. So now we can scale our group and it'll scale both our text and our background at the exact same time. Now obviously our text is way too big, so let's select this text and drop down this size quite a bit. Let's just say maybe a size of 20. That maybe looks a little bit small. Let's try 30. And again, that's still pretty small, so let's just bump it all the way up to 50. So it's about the same size as our from no stack to full stack. We can justify this in the center by using this center here horizontally and center vertically. So we have our button text right in the dead center. And we're going to change this to be a white colored text because we want to have our background of our rectangle here for our button to be a blue color, which in our case is 0AF. And if we save that, you can see we get this nice accented blue color, which I like to use all across my different applications. It's kind of like my brand color. So if we zoom this out, we can see we have our nice big learn more button, which is what we want. And I actually think it might be a little bit too large. It's kind of overpowering things. So let's drop down that font size just a little bit. We'll say maybe 40. And we're going to decrease the size of this rectangle a bit. There's no reason that it needs to be quite that big. And if you hold down Alt while scaling, it'll scale from both directions at the same time, keeping your thing centered. So we're just holding down Alt here, scaling that down just a little bit. And you can see that button already looks a lot better. Also, make sure that we scale down our text size as well. I realized that didn't get scaled down. So now the next thing that we can do is change our button to have rounded corners. There's this nice little border radius tool over on the right hand side here. And we can just bump this up and we're just going to make a pill-shaped button. So as you can see here, we could just click this and drag and it'll increase and decrease that border radius for us. We're just making it large enough that we always get this pill-shaped button. And as you can see, we now have that nice big learn more button. I'm going to decrease the height a little bit. I think it's a little bit too tall. And there we go. We have that nice learn more button that people can click on in order to learn more about this bootcamp. Let's just make sure that this button is dead center in our page, just like that, and that looks great. The next thing that I want to work on inside of this section of our application is going to be the nav bar that goes across the top, so our users always can navigate to the different sections of our web page. So again, let's add this Learn More button into our title section so that we know everything in here is our title section. We have our background, and then we're going to create another rectangle, which is going to be for our nav. So we'll just create this at the very top of our page here, and we're going to put this inside of a group, which we'll just call nav. Now we have that rectangle inside of our group, and we can change the background of this rectangle. And something that I want to do is make it pretty much blend in with the background of our image at the top, but then it'll stand out really well over top of the white background of the rest of our app. So an easy way to do that for us is we can select this fill here for our rectangle. And what we can do is we can select the eyedropper tool, which will allow us to select a color from inside of our application. And I want to select one of these colors for our background. So let's just select here. And as you can see, that's giving our background here of our nav bar a very similar color to the actual image that we have it inside of. So it kind of blends into the background of our image, which is great. And then when we put this nav bar over something that's white, it's going to really stand out. So I think that looks really good. Next thing we want to do is drag our logo into that frame. So let's just drag this logo over into our nav bar. Make sure we get it nice and centered inside that nav bar. And make sure we drag this into our nav grouping just so everything stays really clean. So now we have our logo inside there, which is exactly what we want. The next thing that we need to work on is going to be all of our different navigation links on the right hand side. And for this particular landing page, we're going to have 3 different sections. We're going to have a curriculum section, which kind of describes what our application and bootcamp is about. Next, we're going to have a pricing section, which is going to say how much it cost. And then lastly, we're going to have a contact form. So that's going to be our contact button. So let's add in these different types here. So let's just select our text tool. And what we're going to have is a first text of curriculum, just like that. Expand this out a little bit. I want this to fill the entire height of our nav bar so that we can easily expand and collapse it as we need to. Drag it into that nav group, and we'll change our color here, obviously, to be white, so it's easy to read. And then I'm just going to copy this down so that we have pricing, just like that. And I'm going to drag this in here. And again, just make sure that these are the exact same width as our text. So we can do that double click technique to do that. And then lastly, let's copy this one more time, and we're going to have our third text, which is going to say contact. And now in order to equally space these elements out from one another, one trick that you can do is if you have something selected, it'll tell you how far apart it is from other elements, as you can see here. If we line these up, when we get to this point, it'll have this text 72 over here, essentially saying there's 72 pixels between each one of these different elements. So that's one easy way to space our elements out equally. But we can also just put these inside of a group. And now with that group selected, we get a new option over here in this section, which is our spacing. So as we increase and decrease, it's going to change the spacing between our individual elements. So let's zoom this out a little bit so that we can get an overarching view of our entire app. Select that group and kind of place it where we want it to be. And let's just say we're going to reduce the spacing a little bit until we get something we like, maybe right about there. And then let's drop this into the corner just like this. And there we go. We have our entire navigation section done for our nav bar. But one problem is our nav bar is kind of tall. It's a little bit taller than it needs to be. So let's just shrink this nav bar down a little bit. We can just select our rectangle, shrink this down to maybe about there, and then just make sure we center everything else inside of it, just like that. So now we have our nice and smaller looking nav bar, which I think looks really good. One thing to note though, is the most important part of our application is this contact form button. So let's make sure we really emphasize that contact form and also reduce these items in size a little bit because their font is pretty large. So we can just select our group here and select each one of our elements inside of it so that we can actually change our font size. And let's just drop this down to maybe 30. And we also don't want this to be bold. We're just going to use a normal book font just like this. And now that we have this so much smaller, if we select our group, we can actually reduce the spacing in between these elements as well. But you'll notice that option is not showing up here. So in order to get this option to show back up, we need to click this up here where we can redistribute our horizontal spacing. And if we click that, you can see it evenly distributes our horizontal spacing, and we have the ability to shrink or grow that spacing as needed. So let's just shrink that down a little bit like this and bump this back into the corner. I think that looks pretty good. Make sure it's centered just like that. And now we can draw our button around this contact section. So again, let's grab out a rectangle, put that dead center over top of our contact button, and let's just group this here and call it contact button. And now we want to just select our rectangle and change the color to be that same 0AF color. Round out our corners. And let's make the text inside of here bold so that it really sticks out compared to the rest of our text. And if we zoom out, you can see that now that contact button really looks like it's more clickable. I think bold might be a little strong though, so we'll use this medium font instead. That way it's just slightly more emphasis, but not quite over the top. And with that, you can see that our entire nav bar is complete. The only thing left to do for this header section is to add a little arrow indicator at the bottom to tell people that they have the ability to scroll down to see more information. So I have this nice little arrow icon that we can use here. Let's just zoom that in, make sure we fill this in as white. And we just want to make sure this is in the dead center towards the bottom. And I think if we look at that, that looks really good. And you can imagine inside of your actual project, you can make this have a little up and down animation so people really know that they can scroll down to figure out more information. The next thing we need to work on is going to be the next section of our application. So let's click on our frame and actually scale this out as big as we need it to be. So let's just drag it down here quite a ways. And one thing you'll immediately notice is our header actually spills over the edge of our application. We want to make sure that this header image is only ever as tall as our single page, our 1080 height. So what we can do is go into our background section here, and we're actually going to use a mask. So what we want to do is just create a rectangle that is the exact size that we want. So we're just going to draw it here to be the exact same size that we want our image to be, 1920 by 1080. And we're going to drag this down into all the way down here, our background, and we're going to put it at the very bottom of our background. And what we can do is we can click this button up here, which essentially says use as mask. And what that's going to do is it's going to cut off everything that is outside of this rectangle. And since this rectangle is only 1,080 pixels tall, all of the extra image stuff that's below that, as you can see by that blue outline, is completely hidden by this mask. And masks are based on the group that the item is inside of. So as you can see, everything above this in the group is being cut off, which is exactly what we want. So now that we have that done, we can work on our next section, which is going to be our curriculum section. So let's just pop out a text element here, which is going to say curriculum, curriculum, just like that. And we just want to bump up the size of this quite a bit. So let's try maybe 48 and maybe a little bit bigger. We'll do 72 and maybe 96. I think 96, a little big. We'll do 72. So we have our header section, shrink that down just like this, and we'll put it in the dead center of our screen, kind of towards the top. That looks pretty good to me. And let's make sure that this is bolded because we want this to really stick out. I mean, this is the header of our entire application, so that really sticks out. Now, the next thing to do is work on the content inside of this section. But first, let's clean up our sidebar over here. We have our nav, our title, and our background. We can actually group all these together, including our down arrow, inside of one other group, which we're just going to call our header. And then this curriculum, we're going to put in its own group, which we're going to call curriculum. There we go. And let's drag this below the header just so it's easier to see in the hierarchy. So now we have our curriculum section with our curriculum title in it. And what we need to do is create our curriculum content. And what we're going to do in this content is we're going to have an image, which is one of these 6 images, followed by some text. And it's going to be in sort of a 2-column layout. So we're going to have an image, text, and then another image text over here, and have 3 rows of that. That'll have a really nice UI of explaining exactly what our application does. So what we want to do is we'll just come in here and drag our first one down. We'll say HTML5 is going to be the first point that we're going to cover. And what we want to do is make sure that we have some text next to this. So for our text, we're just going to say, start with the basics by learning HTML and CSS to build your first website. So this is kind of some marketing text. We essentially want to entice the user saying that this is a really great program and you're going to learn all these amazing things. Make sure we spell learning properly though, otherwise that would look pretty bad. And let's drop this size down quite a bit. We'll say maybe 18, that's a little bit small. Let's do maybe 24. I think that looks pretty good. And we also don't want this to be bold, obviously. Let's change it back to a normal book font. And let's just drag this in next to our HTML icon. And actually we'll do a slightly larger font. Let's do 30. I think that looks a little bit better. It's a little easier to read. And we're also going to make this left aligned. We don't want this to be centered because that'll obviously look really strange. And I also think that book sizing is a little bit too thin, so we'll go with medium here just so it sticks out and is a little easier to read. And also, we're going to change the color of this text to be the same color as our nav bar up here. So let's select that nav bar and copy over this color and make sure that we apply that to our text fill, just so we have a slightly less black text. Because when you have black on white, like pure black on pure white, it's really high contrast and difficult to read. It's kind of painful for the eyes. So just reducing the darkness of that black color is really going to help with readability. We can do the same thing with this HTML5 icon. We'll change that fill to that same color, and it helps it fade out a little bit into the background, which is what we want. And it also makes it so it's not so harsh to the user reading it. So let's add a little bit more spacing in here, make that look good, expand this out. So it covers 3 lines. I think that looks pretty good. And also let's group these together and we'll just say curriculum cell, just like that. So now we have an actual cell worth of content. The next thing we want to do is make sure we copy this down and do this again directly below it. So we're going to have another cell down here. And this one is going to have obviously a different image. We use this VS Code icon. So let's delete this HTML one and drag in this VS Code one and make sure that we have it inside the correct curriculum cell. So this first curriculum cell here is number 1. We'll drag these so they're in order. And then number 2 is down here. And we'll change this to be a different fill. We're just going to want to copy that fill from our text. Exact same fill we used for everything else. There we go, just like that. And that looks great. And we can even change this text if we want. For example, we could say use the latest technology for editing and creating amazing web applications. There we go. Just something to entice the user that's coming to this web application. Now we can do this one more time by copying down this curriculum cell so that we have another curriculum cell. Just do that directly below, maybe right here, for example. Change out the text inside of this one, which is going to say create, stunning designs by using modern design tools like Figma and Sketch. There we go. And let's copy this icon in there instead of the VS Code icon. So we can delete that, drag this icon in, and make sure that we put it inside of our cell. And of course, change the color to be the same color we used for our text. So we'll just copy that in just like that. And now we have all 3 of these rows completely done. And what we want to do is group these 3 things together into one single column. So we'll say curriculum column. And of course, let's make sure we drag this into our curriculum section. So now we can actually space these columns out from each other, just like this, as you can see here. And let's just do a little bit of space between them, maybe something like that. Looks pretty good. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but I think for now that looks pretty good. So now that we have this curriculum column done, we can essentially just duplicate this for our other column. So let's just copy this over to here, and this is going to be for our other column. And let's make sure we group these columns together into our curriculum grid, and that way we can space these out as much as we want, as you can see here. But for now, I think this curriculum grid right here looks really good, and we just want to make sure it's completely centered. Next thing to do is change out our icons. We're going to use these 3 icons instead. So let's get the icons we currently have deleted. We'll just drag in our node icon up here first. So we have this node icon, make sure it's centered. Our database icon, which again, we want to be centered. Just like that. And we'll get rid of this and drag in our React icon. And of course, we're going to change the color of all 3 of these different containers to be this 222 F2B color, same as the rest of our text. And we're going to want to change the text inside of here. So we'll just change this text to say build interactive web applications with the world's most popular backend. There we go. Let's just increase that a little bit. It's a little bit wider, looks a little bit better. Next, we'll say manage application data by learning SQL and NoSQL database architecture. And again, this one needs to be just a little bit wider. And lastly, we'll say use the most popular front-end framework to create modern PWAs. There we go. And this is our entire curriculum section essentially done. Just make sure we capitalize this use here so it looks professional. There we go. And as you can see, we were able to include our icons. We're able to include our text, everything, and we're able to lay it all out really nicely by using that grid system and that space evenly system. As you can see, when we select this, we can really nicely space these out, which is great for when you want to create this type of content. So that's our entire curriculum section done. Let's move on to our next section, which is going to be this pricing section here. And in order to easily distinguish these sections, something that I like to do is to have essentially what I call an accent section. So what you do is you just create a rectangle. So we'll create it in here, a rectangle, and you want to give it a color. In our case, we're going to use our accent color of OAF. And this is going to just give it a really stark color, and it's going to separate it from the section that came before it, which is this curriculum section. We don't have to worry about using any types of weird borders or weird color gradients. All we have to do is just this really sharp contrasting color section, which perfectly distinguishes these two sections from one another. So now that we have this color, we can put our content inside of it. So let's make sure that we drag this rectangle down, group it up, and this is going to be our pricing section. And it's really important that when you're creating your groups inside of your stuff, that you have them inside of individual sections. It just makes it so much easier to work with. And as you can see, these icons are not actually in the sections they should be. So I'm going to make sure that I drag these icons down. So the node icon is going to go inside of this section with our node icon. Our SQL icon is going to go in here. And lastly, our React icon is going to go in there, just to make working with this so much easier. Now the next thing to do is add the title for our pricing section. So we can come in here, and you may think we would just put pricing, but actually, since this bootcamp is free, we're just going to put the text free inside of here, and we're going to really bump that text up, make it really large. Let's see how that looks if we make it max width. It's a little bit too big, so we'll maybe try 100. I think that looks a little bit better, but maybe 80. Maybe 90. Let's do 90. I think that looks pretty good. We're going to make this bold so it sticks out, and white so it sticks out over top of that background. Now let's drag that in here, give it a little bit of padding around the top, and that looks pretty good. The next thing to work on is going to be the text that goes below this free, just kind of describing the free a little bit further. So let's bump that text down quite a bit. We'll say 48. And then we're just going to type this in that says, "That's right. All of this amazing content is available." Available completely for free on YouTube. There we go. Make an exclamation point. And we're again going to need to drastically reduce this. Let's try 24. That looks pretty good. We're going to make it not bold. We just want it to be medium. And of course, that white color. And let's expand this out a little bit so it fits onto 2 lines. I think that looks really good on 2 lines. And there we go. That's our free section done. Let's just reduce the size for padding. We don't quite need that much padding around it. I think that looks pretty good. And we'll maybe add a little bit more space here. And drag this down a little bit. There we go. I think that looks... there we go. That looks pretty good. And that's our free section completely done. The next thing that we want to work on is this final contact form, which is going to be the last part of our application. So let's just drag our frame down quite a bit more, just like we have here, and work on that contact section. So this contact section is similar to curriculum in that it has a title. So we can just copy this curriculum title down and put it about right here and say contact instead. And just make sure that this is dead center, just like, oops, that, there we go. And we want to make sure that this contact section is not inside of our curriculum section. We want it to be its own grouping. So we'll say contact section for that group title. And inside of here, we can work on our text boxes and our labels. So what I want to do is I want to create a rectangle. This is going to be for our input. We'll just drag this out. We don't want any fill around this, but we do want to have a stroke. This is essentially a border. And we're just going to have here a 1 pixel border, which is going to be that same color as the rest of our text. And we're going to give it slightly rounded edges. So we're just going to round it just a little bit till it looks kind of nice. I think that looks pretty good here with those slightly rounded edges. And now this is going to be the actual box for our input. And I'm actually going to up this border size slightly bigger to be a border of 2, just so it's easier for you to see on your screen. And I think that actually even looks a little bit better. Now the next thing to do is drag this into our contact section and add a label over top of it. So the label for this, if we reduce that font size down to maybe, let's try 36, we're going to have this be the name of the user. and we want to line up the text box to the very edge, and we're going to group these together. So let's group together this rectangle and our name, and this is going to be just called input. We'll just have it a generic input. And now what we can do is actually just copy this input, and this is going to be our email field, which we're just going to put over here right next to our name field. And we're going to want to select both of these. Whoops. And I only want to make sure I get these two inputs, so we'll just select them from the side here and just drag them out so they're in the dead center of our screen. Just like that, it looks a lot better. And from here, we can just change this to say email, exactly like that. Now the next thing to work on is another input, so we'll copy down a new input, but this is going to be for the message of our text. So we actually want the input box itself to be quite large because it's going to be the entire message they're sending us. So let's say we want it to be about that big, and we'll change this label to say message. And of course, obviously increase that size till it fits. There we go. So now we have that portion of our contact form done, which is great. Let's group together our inputs into a grouping, which we'll just call form. And we're going to drag this up so that's pretty close to our contact. I think that looks pretty good. And also I noticed that these texts out here are not in our pricing section. So let's just drag those in just so it looks a little bit cleaner in our hierarchy. And now inside of this form, we need to create another rectangle, but this time it's going to be for our button. So we'll create that down here, drag it into our form, and we want to use that same 0AF color that we've been using everywhere else. And instead of doing a pill-shaped button, I'm just going to do slightly rounded corners like that. Now up next, we're going to want to put our text inside of that button, which is just going to say send. And we're just going to change the color of that to be white so it's easy to see. And we'll bump up that font size a little bit. Maybe we'll try 36, and maybe even bump it all the way up to 48. 36 looks better, so let's do 36, and we'll make it bold. And then to make sure that that text is centered in our rectangle, we can group those two together, just call it button, and then we can make sure that our text is the exact same size as our rectangle. So we'll scale this down to be the same size as our rectangle, and use the centering trick, so we centered it horizontally and vertically over here, and then we'll just decrease the size of this rectangle, using that Alt trick to make sure we scale it from both sides. And there we go. That is our send button completely done. Let's actually scale down the rectangle a little bit on the top side too. It's a little bit too tall. So we'll just scale it down this way, and we'll drag over that button into the right side of our form, just like that. And I think that font's a little bit too big, so we'll bump that down to maybe 30. There we go, that looks so much better. And that's our send button completely done for our application. And the next thing we want to work on is going to be our footer. And our footer is actually the exact same as our header navigation. So what we can do is make this into a component. So we can right click this and we can just say create component down here. And now when we copy this component, it gives us a copy that when we change the base component, it'll actually change the copied component. So let's just drag this down here for now, at the bottom. And what we can do, make sure that we drag this out into its own section. For our nav down here, we're just going to call it footer. Now, if I were to change something up here, for example, I were to remove curriculum, you can see it removes it down here from the footer too. They're linked together, so now all the changes we make to one nav will also happen to the other nav. And now all we need to do is shrink down our frame. So let's just scale this down a little bit. And of course, we need to make sure our footer is where we want it to be. So let's put it just right about there. Shrink down our frame. As you can see, we now have our application completely done. And that's all there is to creating this landing page design. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I created this project inside my CSS course. So if you want to up your skills as a designer and a developer, make sure you check out my CSS course where you can learn everything you need to know about CSS. Also, you can check out my other videos linked over here and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this.